Welcome to Walking with Conviction in an Anxious Age. I'm Pastor Chris Miller. The world is unsettled, but that doesn't mean you have to be. This podcast is for people who want to walk calmly and confidently with Jesus in uncertain times. I'm not here to tell you what to think or what to do. You make your own decisions. My aim is simple: to help you walk with Christ in a way that cultivates Christ-like character through clear thinking, intentional living, and confidence formed by conviction. We'll talk about scripture, culture, faith, and everyday obedience. And together, we'll learn to walk faithfully with Jesus day in and day out. We're walking this road together, faithful, grounded, and free. Have you noticed there's a lot of jerks out there? There's probably a couple in the comments right now. One of the things I've noticed, probably more so in recent times, something that I've been thinking about is how poorly people often treat each other. And I think there's reasons for that. Sometimes I think it's fear, it's stress, it's chaos in their life. And it's a reality, but it doesn't have to be. Maybe you've heard the saying that we hurt the ones we love the most. And as always, I don't want to overgeneralize things, but we've all said things to someone we were close to that were hurtful. And we've all probably seen someone treat someone poorly and noticed that and had a reaction to it. And like I said, it's a product of several things. Our environment growing up affects the way we react to people, the way we interact with people. The model we see when we're growing up teaches us how to do that. And sometimes we may see others as a threat and we hurt them before they can hurt us. Or then there's the person who never seems to have harsh words to say to anyone. And we all know someone like that. They're calm. I don't know, peaceful. They never seem to argue. And have you ever seen that person blow up where they eventually get to the place where they've had enough and they just explode? And when they do, they go off like Mount Vesuvius. And I think that's because along the way, they haven't communicated what's bothering them, and they haven't managed the chaos and the stress that they're going through previously. And it's finally built up enough to the point where they just let it all go at once. They communicate it all at once. And it's often the people that they care about the most who are closest to them that are in the fallout area when that happens, or the impact zone. In counseling, sometimes I tell people that we all have a capacity for stress, for chaos in our life. And I view it as something similar to a glass of water. I illustrate it that way. We all walk around with this glass, and some are bigger, some are smaller, but we all have one. And we all have different amounts of water in that glass. But we all have the glass. We all have some water in it. Stress, chaos, just the things that life throws at us. The fuller it gets, the more attention we give to it. And once it's filled to the brim, it's hard to pay attention to anything but that. You've probably seen a kid walk around with a glass full of water, or, you can try it yourself. You walk around with a glass like this and you pay attention to it and you're trying not to spill it, but inevitably you still tend to splash some out the sides. You get it on you. If someone's very close to you, you might get part of it on them. And when that glass is full, it's difficult to pay attention to anything else. And when we interact with people, we interact differently when we're concentrating on that glass of water. It's like, don't bother me, I'm going to spill this. And once it's that full, there's no room for anything else. And if anyone pours anything into it, there's not room. So it spills over. And we inevitably spill some of it. And like I say, if someone's very close to us, it's going to end up on them. And if they say the wrong thing, we might just throw the whole glass on them. When I met my wife, Christine, long time ago now, she was working as a waitress And I've always been impressed with wait staff and their ability to carry these big trays full of food and drinks and move fluidly and skillfully. And they just don't dump that stuff. I can't fill up an ice cube tray without dumping part of it at least. And many years ago, I was bartending at a fundraising event, and my wife Christine was waitressing. This was after we'd been married a little while, and she was carrying around these huge trays full of pints of beer. And it wasn't a church fundraiser, by the way. We weren't even in church at the time, but she was probably carrying at least 10 pints of beer on these trays. And at one point during the evening, she slipped and she dumped, like it was a fresh tray. It was full and she dumped it. And she didn't just spill it, she spilled it on someone. And fortunately, the guy was amicable about it, but he wasn't very happy either. But even when people are really good at carrying a lot, occasionally they slip and spill things. And even when we're really good at carrying stress, chaos, dealing with those things, occasionally we have spillovers. And that glass that we carry, that's our capacity for stress and chaos and the things life throws at us, it's always going to have something in it. Stress is not a bad thing. We need a little bit of stress to get us out of bed in the morning, to keep us going, to keep us motivated. But we don't want that glass to get too full, because the fuller it gets, the more difficult everything around us becomes. And there are many ways to manage the level of stress and keep it at a manageable level. And there's a lot of techniques you can use to do that. And they will help reduce that. And those are good. They're necessary at times, but there's always more going in the glass. So we need to learn how to keep that at a manageable, reasonable level, because sometimes it can be pretty full and we can still manage it, but it becomes very difficult. But there are always times that capacity for stress, chaos, anxiety, fear, whatever it might be, fills up faster than we can deal with it. And it'll fill up and it'll spill out. And we end up spilling it on the people around us. And that happens to everyone once in a while. Nobody avoids that completely. But when that capacity for chaos is outrunning our ability to deal with it, that's when we need to look beyond the glass itself and managing the level in it and look at what's actually causing the stress and the chaos. And if I were walking through that with someone, what I would do is we'd probably look at what's causing that stress in the first place. What is it that's causing your glass to fill up? And we'd look at those situations and maybe look at the decisions that surround them. Maybe someone needs to reorganize some things, look at the decisions they're making, maybe do things a little differently and evaluate those steps. And maybe they can do some things that'll help them avoid that in the future. And that's a very real way and a helpful way of dealing with those things. But through that process, things can get better and we can keep that stress at a manageable level. But what if that's not the case? What if you're someone who's organized? What if you take good care of yourself? What do you're mentally healthy, you're mentally stable, but you still feel anxious, you still feel stressed, and that capacity for stress is constantly boiling over. And you don't really understand why. It's just something that you are having a difficult time dealing with. Um, Maybe things outside of your control are getting on top of you. And again, that happens to everyone sometimes. But we could also be in a situation like that. And then we look over someone who is in a similar situation. And for some reason, they're doing just fine. They don't seem to have any problem with it. Or we could see someone who's in a worse situation than our own, and they seem to be okay. They aren't struggling like we are in a similar situation. And then we can look at that and think, well, what's wrong with me? Why am I having such a problem dealing with my capacity for stress and chaos and fear and anxiety. Why do I struggle so much with this? I'm healthy. Maybe, I don't have mental problems, whatever. Um, Sometimes psychiatric problems can be an issue. Christians have traditionally kind of wrestled with that idea, but the reality is not everything's a spiritual issue. We live in a broken world, and sometimes a brain may not function properly and needs some medical attention, and that's okay. But that's not always the case. So if that's not the problem, and I've done all of these other things to manage my stress level, I'm making good decisions, but I'm still feeling overwhelmed. If I'm feeling anxious and chaotic, what can I do? What do I need to do to fix that? Where do I need to look? Personally, I don't think it's simply chaos, stress, what's going on in our lives that fill up the glass, because we can look at someone in a similar situation who's doing just fine. And those things are always going to exist. They're not going away. There's always going to be stress. There's always going to be difficult situations, circumstances. Things aren't always going to go the way we would like them to. And that's always going to be a reality. Those things aren't going anywhere. And I've had conversations with people over the years who feel that, well, I shouldn't be worried or I shouldn't be afraid, especially as a Christian. One of the things people have, worries and concerns about is surgery or illness or something like that. That's often the case. And sometimes Christians think that if they feel fear or they feel worry or they're concerned about something, they're not spiritual enough or they don't have enough faith. But that's just not true. Anyone who is going through a difficult situation is going to feel a degree of stress. If you are, going in for surgery, there's going to be a level of fear that comes with that. And you're going to feel that. And you'd be weird if you didn't. That's just reality. Not everything means something is wrong with you just because you feel stressed. And when someone just simply puts on a mask of spirituality and pretends, well, I'm not afraid or I have enough faith, so this doesn't bother me, it doesn't really change anything. All that does is it just hides what concerns us from other people. But the Lord still knows. We're not going to fool him, obviously. But the stress and chaos of life are often a product of how we feel about a given situation, not so much the situation itself, but how we feel about the circumstances. And we're always going to have feelings about circumstances. That's just a reality. But how strong those are is something that we can look at and something that in many cases we can change. And anyone who says otherwise is not telling you the truth. We care about things that we're invested in. And the strength of our feelings about a circumstance or a situation directly correlates with how invested we are in that situation. And how invested we are determines whether we're going to be panicked or chaotic or whether we're going to be settled and calm or, we're going to fall somewhere in between. How invested we are ultimately determines how much a scenario affects our capacity to deal with stress, to deal with chaos, the things that life constantly throws at us. And sometimes it's okay to have strong feelings. But at the same time, sometimes something like, someone didn't say hello to me at church, or the temperature in the room is wrong, someone says something a little bit off to me, shouldn't cause me to blow up. It shouldn't blow my life apart. That's an overreaction to a situation that doesn't warrant it. And sometimes we find ourselves in a situation where we do overreact to situations that just don't warrant the reaction. Right now, the war in Iran, all that kind of stuff, it shouldn't cause me panic. But for some, it does. There's nothing wrong with being concerned about those things, concerned about the stresses that come with everyday life. But the size of our reaction directly correlates with the size of our investment in a situation. Stress and chaos, they're part of life. They're not going away. They're always going to be there. And like we talked about previously in the last series we went through, stress, chaos, those are tensions to manage. They're problems we're not going to solve. But when we have an unwarranted reaction, it's because we have overinvested somewhere. When our reaction is more than it should be, it's probably because we're overinvested in something. Something's out of order. Our love is disordered. We love something too much or maybe something too little. And when we do that, when we find ourselves overreacting to something, what we're doing is we are overpaying emotionally for an event, which fills up our glass, our capacity for stress, and causes us to be less able to manage other areas of life and how we react to people changes. Imagine it like this, just as an illustration. If every time you have a situation that you react to that causes you stress, that's chaotic, you don't pay in emotion, but you pay in actual cash instead, and you have a budget to spend. Say it's $100, and it costs you to react. Every time you have a reaction, you pay a certain amount of money in for that reaction. And I kind of wish that was the case sometimes. People would calm right down in a hurry. But what we don't want to do is we don't want to pay $75 for a $5 event. That would be silly to do that. And when that happens, it's because we are over investing in something that doesn't warrant it. We've overpaid. As a matter of fact, if we pay $75 for a $5 event, we're getting ripped off. And when we do that, it's because our investments are out of order. But we're not talking about actual cash. What we're talking about is love and where we invest it. If our investments are out of order, our reactions are also out of order. A life that is disordered, a life that is endlessly stressed, full of anxiety, fear, is probably because we are overpaying emotionally for certain events because we've overinvested in them. And as would be expected, Jesus has an answer for that too, and how to deal with that. And we're going to read 3 verses from the book of Matthew, chapter 6 today. We're going to look at verses 19 through 21. And as we talk about this, you might take a few notes, mental notes, maybe even write them down, and then go back later and read through Matthew chapter 6 from the perspective of what we're talking about today. And you'll see that chapter in a whole new light when you do. But this is what these verses say. Matthew chapter 6, verses 19 through 21. I've got them up on the screen here. I'm going to read them to you. It says, "Do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth where moth and rust destroy and where thieves break in and steal, but store up for yourselves treasures in heaven where neither moth nor rust destroy and where thieves do not break in nor steal. For where your treasure is, there will your heart be also." Matthew chapter 6 is viewed as a chapter about charitable giving and is often used to teach about that, to teach about charitable giving, being generous, giving sacrificially, things like that. And there's nothing wrong with that. I've done that before and I'll probably do it again. It does include that. And the thing that I hope we'll take away today from these verses is that the same principles apply to many different areas of life. And I like the word treasure. I'm glad that these verses use the word treasure because it sounds so much better than money. Money to me is boring. We can hunt for treasure. I might have something I treasure. I do have things I treasure. And to me, the word money says spreadsheet, but treasure sparks my imagination and makes me think about adventure. I like the word treasure. Treasure is something special. It's something I'm careful with. It's something I am careful what I do with it, where I send it, where I keep it. And Matthew chapter 6, like I said, it's often viewed as a chapter that teaches about charitable giving. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's certainly the case. But the principles have a much more broad application than just finance. Treasure is something we possess, but it's more than just money. And it involves a lot more than that. Treasure might be something money can't buy, like time or attention or emotional energy, ambition, trust, devotion. Those are all treasures, talents and abilities. My mind, even my entire life is something I could consider treasure. Jesus says, don't store those things up on earth, store them up in heaven. And Jesus isn't just talking about giving or saving money. He's telling us to deliberately place our resources, invest our treasure, our energy, our hope, our trust, faith, devotion, all of those things. He says he's telling us to invest those things into something that we believe will matter eternally, something that matters ultimately. And then he goes on to tell us why we should do that. He says, do that because where your treasure is where your heart is going to be also. And what that means is that wherever you invest yourself, your treasure, time, talents, abilities, your mind, your life, whatever that is, your heart is going to follow that. Your heart chases your treasure. Who you are, what you're becoming, how you walk through life, deal with difficult situations, your emotions, your reactions, whether you are stable or panic, is determined by where you invest your treasure. Whoever or whatever has your treasure also has your heart. Your heart follows your treasure. And your heart determines what you love most. So wherever you invest, your heart follows that. That determines what you love the most. If we have a disorder in our life, overwhelming stress, chaos, anxiety, fear, things that just never go away, and we have reactions that are more than they should be, that's often the result of disordered love, loving things out of order. It's not so much what we do, what we don't have. It's not so much what someone did to us. It's not our circumstances, what happens to us, who, does or doesn't do things around us, the things that feel anxious or make our life feel chaotic, as it is our emotional reaction to that and how much love we have invested in a given situation. It's when we overreact, it's probably the result of overinvesting in something that ultimately doesn't matter. When we do that, something is in the wrong place in the hierarchy of what we love, because there is a hierarchy to that. And here's an idea of what that should look like. Ordered love. If we're going to set our love in an order of hierarchy, it's going to be God at the top, God's will next, then people, then responsibilities and calling. And then at the bottom of that hierarchy is comfort, preferences, and pleasure. And maybe you've heard sometimes as Christians, we think, well, I shouldn't love comfort. I shouldn't love preferences. I shouldn't love pleasure. But that's just not true. It's okay to love those things. It's okay to love achievement. It's okay to love success. It's okay to love stability and comfort and all of those things. We just need to keep that in its proper place in the hierarchy of love. Usually, the problem isn't with loving the wrong things, it's loving good things in the wrong order. When we love the right things in the wrong order, our love becomes disordered and our life feels chaotic. That creates chaos and stress when we love things out of order. You may have heard sin defined as, or I like to define it as a good God given desire exercised outside of God's intended context. And I would guess that the majority of sins people deal with, things they consider sin, are related to the things that are at the bottom of that hierarchy, the comfort, the preferences, pleasure, things like that. That's often what we see as sin. And that's where a lot of sin comes from. Those things bring us pleasure. And we have a good God given desire for many of those things. And that's okay. We just have to be careful not to exercise it outside of the context for which God intends it, because He gives us a context in which to enjoy those things. And that's not simply to control us. We don't have commands just because God simply wants to tell us what to do, but because the desires He gives us are very powerful and they create consequences depending on how we exercise them. And they can be good or they can be bad. But the reason we have God's commands is so that we can navigate the world by exercising our desires in the best way possible and navigate the world in the best way possible. You take something like sexual desire, for instance, that's a strong one. And it's a good God given desire. There's nothing wrong with it. His intended context for us to exercise that desire is within the context of a marriage covenant between God and a husband and a wife. And inside that context, it's a great thing. It's a wonderful thing. It's positive, and it creates positive things. It creates a strong bond in a marriage. It creates intimacy, understanding. It creates trust. It creates children, all good things inside the marriage covenant. Best place to raise kids. That builds strong families. It builds strong churches. It builds strong communities. The good God given desires that He has given us have powerful consequences. And those consequences are powerfully good when exercised within God's intended context, the boundaries within which He's given us. But when we step outside of those boundaries, that's what transgression means. It's moving past God's boundaries. They create negative consequences, bad consequences. Exercise correctly, desires build strength. They build things, they build them up, they make them better. Desires are from God. They are very powerful. Um, but the consequences they bring about are also powerful. When exercised outside of God's intended context, the results are often pain, chaos, and destruction. God has given us a big responsibility in stewarding the desires that He's given us. And it's important that we steward them within the boundaries He's given us, within the context He intends those desires to be exercised. And that makes how we order our love vitally important because that affects how we exercise those desires. When we sin, what we're doing often is taking something that we love, that's okay to love, and placing it in the wrong place in the order of love, in the hierarchy of love. And in this case, where we're talking about, sexual desire or comfort, pleasure, anything in that bottom rung of the hierarchy, what we're actually doing is we are taking that and we are moving it way up the hierarchy. Um, we're moving it up to number one or number two. We are placing sin or comfort or pleasure, personal desire, whatever it might be, above God's will, or in some cases, maybe even God Himself. You can think about that for yourself. So we have a big responsibility in how we exercise our desire, how we order our love. It matters that we consciously are aware of that and that we do that. And the difference between the bottom and the top of the hierarchy is probably easier to spot than when we get closer together in the middle between things. And at the bottom of the hierarchy, it's pretty easy to pick out. It's pretty easy to see. We're pretty clear on what we should and shouldn't do when we're talking about the things lower down the hierarchy and the distance we have to move those to put them above God's will or even God Himself. When it gets a little more ambiguous is when we start to get in the middle of the hierarchy. We're talking God's will, people, um, calling and responsibility, and at the bottom we have comfort, preferences, and pleasure. And when we take something, for instance, like calling and responsibility and people, they're right there next to each other. And this, may not even be a sinful thing to do, but what it can do when we mix those up, it causes stress and it causes chaos. I'm called to be a pastor, and I love what I do. Part of my responsibility is studying God's word, digging into it, and then sharing what I find with people, particularly, people in the podcast, people in my congregation. And that's what I do. I love that. I even have, a good God given desire to do that. I love my calling. But people and calling are very close together in that hierarchy. People sit right on top of calling and responsibility. And for example, I may think of someone who I haven't seen in a while or someone that I need to contact, but I've also have a responsibility. Maybe it's Saturday, tomorrow's Sunday. I'm not prepared yet. I need to get this done. And I may bump my calling and my responsibility above people. I may need to contact someone. They may need to hear from me. They may have something going on where they could use some pastoral help. I'm called to feed the flock. That's my responsibility. But it's very easy to shuffle that order. I love studying. I love sharing what I've studied with you. And my responsibility in that case, frankly, it can be very pressing. When you've got a lot to do, I know Sunday's coming, whether I'm ready or not. And, frankly, my responsibility and calling often wins. And I don't like that. It's something I'm trying to work on, but it's something that happens. And is that sinful? I don't know. But I know what that can do is it can cause stress and chaos. My love for scripture, it's a good God given desire. But sometimes I love my calling and responsibility over people. And that sounds terrible, but it's not always the case. And it's easy to flip flop those two in the hierarchy. And that's something I need to work on. And it's so easy to do. I can justify it in my own mind. I have to get this done. I've got to do this now because I'm not going to have time later. And, that person is just going to have to wait for now. And even in that scenario, I don't necessarily have to be the one who contacts someone. I can delegate things like that, but it does need to be a priority. The priority is people. I need to love people a bit more than I love my calling and responsibility. So if I don't do that, what happens? Is that sinful? That's a hard question for me to answer. I'm not really sure. But when I place my calling and responsibility above people, it does cause stress and it can cause chaos. I might become resentful or irritated when someone contacts me when I'm trying to study. I might be annoyed by that. That's could be a result of that. That can cause stress. If I do, contact someone and put them first, um, I might feel resentful because I still have other things that I want or need to do. But that's because I love my calling and my responsibility more than the people. Like I say, that's something I work on. And I put a lot of work into this stuff. It's not like I just show up and start talking. But that's another way of saying that that's where I invest my treasure. That's where I send my mind. That's where I spend my time. That's where I spend my emotional energy, my effort. And if I do that more with my responsibility and my calling than I do people, I'm going to get things out of order in the hierarchy of love. And we can disorder our love, move things around, and we can justify doing so. And at times, even overlook the fact that we're doing it. But we will still feel the results of that. We'll feel stress because of that. We'll feel chaos because of that. When where we sin and invest our treasure and what gets the largest investment and so on down the line determines the order of our love. But what if I feel like I love preference and comfort, but I don't necessarily feel like I love those other things, or maybe I love a couple of those things. Like maybe I love my investment and, or maybe I love my comfort. Maybe I love people, but the other things I don't necessarily feel like I love them. Um, Matter of fact, maybe there's only one thing I love in that hierarchy. I feel like I love my preferences, I love my comfort, but maybe I don't really feel like I love everything above that. I remember I used to hear people say, "Oh, I love Jesus," or talk about how they love Jesus. And that used to feel kind of weird to me because I didn't really understand what that meant. I equated it to more of a definition of romantic love than the kind of love we're talking about. And I can't just make myself feel like I love something. That's not an emotion that I can just muster up when I feel like it. But that's when we look back to what Jesus said in our passage, and he helps us understand that. He says, "Don't store up treasure on earth, store it up in heaven." That's not a feeling, that's a decision you make. That's an action that you actually take. It's not a feeling or emotion that you muster up. Love is objective before it's emotional. And maybe we have forgotten in some cases. Maybe we've never even realized or heard that our heart is chasing our treasure. We send our treasure ahead, and then our heart follows it. So the love is objective before it's emotional. We take the action before we feel it, at least in this kind of love that we're talking about. But in our mind, because we often view love as a romantic kind of love or just an emotion or something that just kind of happens, we think we feel love first and then we send our treasure to follow it. But we get that backwards. That's not the case. Um, Maybe you've never thought about the fact that there is a hierarchy to what we love, and where we send our treasure is what we love most. And I may love my preferences or a certain pleasure or comfort or hobby, whatever it might be, so I invest all of my treasure in that. But then that puts whatever that is up at the top of the hierarchy, and when we do that, that's going to cause problems. It's going to cause stress, it's going to cause chaos, anxiety, and those things come along with it. And you may not realize that there is an order to our love. Maybe you haven't heard that before, but that doesn't mean it doesn't exist. It does exist for everyone, assuredly. And if you're not intentional about that and decisive and thinking about where you're investing your treasure, it's going to be kind of like shuffling a deck of cards, and things are just going to end up the way they end up. And then the consequences of that are going to follow. And a disordered life often is the result of disordered love. And the top of the hierarchy is reserved for God. That's where he belongs. If we're going to have an ordered and settled life and remain calm and be peaceful, he has to be at the top. That's just the reality. And if he's not in that spot, whatever is in that spot becomes a God. And everyone has a God, whether they realize it or not, whether they recognize it as such. Whatever we put in the top spot is our functional God. That's just a reality. And sometimes as Christians, we get that out of order and we place things above it. Everyone has something they love the most, that they invest their treasure in the most. Whatever that is, that's our functional God. That's a reality. That's the place where we place trust. That's the place where we put our hope, our faith, and the largest portion of our treasure. And when you think about that, think about it like this. Imagine if you move comfort or pleasure, a preference from the bottom where it should be. It's okay to love it. There's nothing wrong with that. But imagine moving that clear up to the top and making that our functional God. And the reality is that whatever that is, comfort and pleasure, preference, those things are going to change. They're going to be affected. They're going to be even attacked at times. Maybe they're going to be taken away. And when that happens, if those things are at the top of the hierarchy, what a person feels like when that happens is if they feel as if they've lost their God. And as a Christian, that's not going to happen. But imagine what that would be like if you did. Everything would fly apart. Of course, you're going to have a big reaction to that because when the things at the bottom of the hierarchy are at the top and they are changed or taken away, we're going to react as if God was taken away or God changed, which he doesn't. So, not only are we going to spend all of our treasure on that, but we're also going to lose it. And then we're going to react to it as if we lost our God, because in a sense, someone who has placed those things at the top of the hierarchy has lost their God. But the good news about that is that it doesn't have to be like that. We don't have to just shuffle our love like a deck of cards and hope it falls out in our favor. We can decide what that hierarchy is going to be. We can decide where we're going to invest our treasure. And that means we can set our love in order. We can have a proper hierarchy of love. But that doesn't do you any good if you don't know who's at the top of that hierarchy. And the Bible tells us that we love God because he loved us first. And you have to start to get your head around that before you can know how to order the hierarchy of love. And the Bible tells us, John 3:16, very well known verse, that God so loved the world that he sent his son, that whoever believes in him would not perish but have eternal life. God sent his son Jesus to die on the cross, to shed his blood so that we can know him. We can know the one who's supposed to be at the top of the hierarchy. If we don't know him, we're never going to be able to order that properly. And things are never going to be quite the way they should. So, what we can take away from this is that we need to know who's at the top. We need to trust Jesus. And we can do that by recognizing that we often love sin too much and we exercise those good God given desires outside of God's intended context. We transgress against him, we sin against him. And that's why we need a savior. That's what Jesus come to do, was to pay the price for our sin on the cross. And he did that for us. And when we place our faith and our trust in him, he reconciles us to God so we can know the one at the top of the hierarchy. So if you haven't done that, I would encourage you to do so. Recognize, hey, you know what? I am sinful. We're all sinful. We're in a broken world. We all need Jesus. And trust him. Put your faith in him. Place him at the top of your hierarchy. And then work on ordering your love. Decide what you're going to love the most. Put God first, then God's will, then people, then calling, then, along with, your responsibilities. And then at the bottom, we can still love preferences and comfort and like things and be happy and enjoy those things. We just don't want to move them too far up the hierarchy. And I'm going to give you a few ways to help you out in doing that. As we do every week, we do this as grow, live, go. Well, I give you something you can do to grow in the concept that we're talking about, and then a way to live that out, and then a way to go, to take that into life with you, take it into your community, to share it with others. So to grow this week, work on intentionally reordering what you love. Think about it, consider it, recognize where you're sending your treasure because your heart is following it. Think about where you're sending it. Intentionally invest it. Where's your time, your emotional energy? Where's your attention? Where's your ambition? Where are those things? And then begin to deliberately place those things in what matters the most and making that your priority. And then live. Live with an awareness that you have an emotional budget. We talked about spending $75 on a $5 event. Recognize, I've got an emotional budget. I have a capacity, but it's not endless. And when your reactions are disproportionate to the situation, do more than just manage the stress. Sometimes we need to learn to do that. because it's helpful to do so. Sometimes our love can be in order and we can still be dealing with a lot and it can get to us. And there are some things that are up at the top of the hierarchy, like people. And when something happens to someone we love, a strong reaction to that is not unwarranted because there's a lot of investment there. But when our reactions are disproportionate to the situation, when we lose something that's just simply a comfort or a preference, it shouldn't blow our life apart. And when it does, it's because we've disordered love. But when your reaction is disproportionate to what it should be given the situation, examine the investment behind it. Think about, okay, how much of my treasure am I actually investing in this? Am I over investing? Am I not investing in things higher up the hierarchy? Ask yourself, okay, what have I loved too much that's caused me to react to this situation in the way I have? And then lastly, go. Take this into the world with you. Take it to work, take it into life, take it to other people, share it. This week, move one investment up the hierarchy. One of the ways you can do that is by intentionally investing in something that's maybe too low. Maybe we're not investing enough in it, but invest more in it. And that may be people, maybe your family, maybe your kids, your wife, a friend, whatever it might be. Maybe you need to feel that you need to invest more in that and do that. Or, maybe I need to invest more in God. Maybe I need to spend more time in prayer, more in his word. Just spend more time with him and invest my treasure in him, whatever it is. But look for something where you can invest more in it and move that person, that thing, whatever it might be, up the hierarchy. Maybe it could be even down at the bottom. Maybe you're just mixing up, responsibility and calling with preference and comfort. And you're saying, okay, I need to invest more in my responsibility and calling, whatever that is. Invest more in that as you go throughout your week. Ordered love is built through investment. And when you invest your treasure, your heart's going to follow. And then you're going to find that your emotions follow that. And then when something happens to maybe break or take away something at the bottom of the hierarchy, you're going to find it's not going to bother you near so much. And I hope you found this helpful. If you have, please maybe share it with someone who you think might find it helpful also. But I look forward to speaking with you again next week. And until then, put your love in order.
Thank you for listening to Walking with Conviction in an Anxious Age. As you go, remember, following Jesus isn't about having all the answers, but walking faithfully with the truth you've been given. Stay present, think clearly, walk intentionally. And wherever Jesus leads you this week, keep walking, faithful, grounded, and free.